Hello and welcome to Dialogue. It's only been 1 month since the Japanese government began discharging nuclear-contaminated water from the Fukushima power plant into the Pacific Ocean, an action that has received much opposition and condemnation from many countries, and a scandal has already been reported. Workers at a demolition site apparently stole potentially radioactive scrap metal and sold it, which violates the process of dealing with contaminated waste. How much do we know about the latest incident? What are the potential consequences if the scrap metal is contaminated? And what has been the impact so far of Japan's move to pump the contaminated water into the ocean? Earlier, I spoke with Herman Tiu Laurel, president of the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute, and Professor Jiayu Bai from the Law School of Nankai University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Laurel. We know the Japanese government has reported that workers at the demolition site near the Fukushima nuclear power plant took and sold iron scraps possibly contaminated with radioactive materials. So you can't help but ask, what is the proper process for dealing with potentially contaminated materials at a site which is not far away from the Fukushima plant?
Well, this is certainly a worrying news. It's a new information that I'm getting as a member of the global public watching and monitoring these developments on the Fukushima nuclear contaminated water disposal. We thought before it was just the water. Now we're finding out there are more things to worry about. And for me, that reflects on the many problems the world has had with the responsibility of the TEPCO and the Japanese government in handling this nuclear power plant crisis and issue.
When this scrap metals transferred from one hand to another, obviously there's a worry that people who touched or who get close with this scrap metal could be sick, for example, because of this radioactive materials. Is that the worry here?
Well, certainly it's a worry for them in particular, because they're the ones who are in close proximity to all these affected materials. But eventually this will also affect many other people outside of Japan, where that's what I am concerned about. And maybe more thorough investigation of this should be done by the international community and not just be left to the Japanese authorities, because this report coming at this late date is not a good sign.
You mentioned about the Japanese government. Of course, people will ask the question if there's a proper process, if there's enough warning, for example, at the demolition site, the workers will be fully aware of the potential dangers. They will not do that kind of, conduct that kind of behavior, like stealing some scrap metal and then sold the metal to somebody else because it's potentially dangerous. So it seems that there's a lack of proper measures or lack of awareness on the side or from the government. So is that the reason probably we should be concerned?
Well, I have been following also the Japanese discussion on the Fukushima disaster all the way to the present. And there are many complaints from the Japanese public. In fact, even during the crisis itself, there was a lot of dubious decisions by the TEPCO authorities, which even the Japanese government authorities had problems with. So there's something seriously wrong in how they're running that giant energy corporation, and it reflects on its relationship with the government and the government's sense of insecurity with regards to this profit-seeking giant energy company of Japan. Maybe something has to be done about that.
Mr. Laurel, what's your top concern about the Japanese side would say after this treatment of the water, there's little or less or very little pollution, let's say, radioactive material, they say, and then when they are put into the ocean, it's almost even lower than the normal level. So it's safe to the public. Do you buy that, or do people think that's safe?
Well, we have been reviewing all the voluminous materials on the internet about these issues. We've heard the experts on the Japanese side trying to reassure the public, but in almost all the reports, there's always that caveat. But some researchers are not sure this will be sufficient to mitigate the risk. So there are experts and researchers who add their voices to the doubtful or to the doubt that they have over the completeness of the cleaning process, of the studies, of the examination. And of course, we are not able to judge the situation in this early stage because this will be going on for many, many years, and millions of tons of it will be dispersed over the years. We're just hoping that in the middle of this next few months and weeks, that something we can raise can really put a stop to this, and can be reviewed by the Japanese government. So pressure is of course part of that, but the Philippines and our own opposition to it is not that sufficient yet. That is why I hope other countries what China has done, take a very same firm position and take economic action that may pressure the Japanese government.
Well, of course, right now it probably is too early to say, whether the water or the seafood is completely safe for now, because it's in the beginning of the some a 30-year-long process. There is a concern, for scientists, for example, from the U.S. Their concern is like there could be accumulation, bioaccumulation of those, let's say, harmful materials. Many years later, that could be really harmful to human being, to the seafood. So if, let's say, the high levels of radioactivity, is discovered in a later stage, is there any way, any means for the government, for the public to file, say, a lawsuit or to ask for financial compensation or penalty against the Japanese side?
Yes, yes, of course. I think if such evidence arises, lawsuits can be filed, financial damages can be imposed. But what does it do to how does it help to do that if the water is already infected by radioactivity? We cannot just reverse that. The ocean is so huge; it's an impossible task. So that is what I think we should be preventing, to have even the possibility of something like that occurring. So far, the only solution is to stop it. We have to stop it, and we have to persuade everybody with a stake in this to push the Japanese government to store it as they have been storing this contaminated water for the past 10 years. Why not another 10 years? It's only money. If it's profit they have a problem with, then well, we can always help them solve it if they are too stingy to spend on the safety of the world. And I have heard the experts on their side say that even more containers, huge containers for this contaminated water may not help because there may be earthquakes. But there are earthquake-proof containment methods and vessels. I think TEPCO just does not want to spend even an additional yen to ensure safety of everyone, safety of the ocean, with very safe methods of storing further emissions of radioactive contaminated wastewater. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, you mentioned a very, I think interesting point here. It's really also it's about the attitudes of how we treat the ocean. The ocean is the common, common area. That's what we have for the surrounding countries. It's not, does not belong to Japan, let's say. And
That's right.
It's not a dump site. Something you don't want, something polluted, something there's dangerous materials like radioactive materials, and then you throw them somehow into the ocean. That's not the right way to deal with the problem, right?
Yes. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that point, that concept of the common areas and things of common interest, common stake of the entire world. This is not a decision that only the Japanese government and TEPCO should be taking. It should be a decision that all of humanity should be working together on. And again, we have to condemn IAEA for its neither here nor there decision, which they should be taking in behalf of the interests of the world and not of the Japanese government or TEPCO, which is what the impression being given by the IAEA's wishy-washy positioning. So where do we turn to? Some governments like China have been doing all it can to try to stop this. Maybe the United Nations. I know the Pacific Islands are also appealing for action on this. In the Philippines, we are aware that in a few months, this uh, radioactive or radio contaminated water will be reaching circulation here in the South China Sea. So we're very concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So these common areas, I think, should be decided upon by all the nations of the world. I don't know how we're going to do it with the UN, and with our government not acting like it should. We don't know where to turn to. Maybe this can be brought to the United Nations by the Chinese government, which is taking leadership on this matter.
Mm-hmm. When Mr. Laurel speak of that, if you take a look at the Western nations, in particular here, like the United States, Australia, who are directly, of course, connected to the ocean here. And then if you look at their official attitudes, they choose to look the other way at the Japanese move. And more than that, if you look at the U.S. embassy or Australian embassy in Japan, for example, they have made an extra efforts to show that they are not concerned at all about this nuclear contaminated water release into the ocean. What do you make of that? And why they are doing that?
Yeah. Well, I can see, I think we can all see the rest of the world outside of the Western powers can see the lackadaisical attitude of the American government, which is leading the West on this matter to the welfare of the world. It seems to reflect on everything else that they're doing. And my perception is that they are damning the entire world because they're losing control of it anyway. But I know, and we've been following the news in West Coast of the United States, where many of the NGOs, many of the experts, environmentalists are protesting against this. But the Americans seems to have seems to have politicized this as a Cold War matter, and that's very unfortunate. And again, that is why we have to keep educating our own people and the global South on why we have to balance off the power of the Western nations on these matters of common interest of the whole world.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned about a politicization of this matter. So are you referring to that somehow they prioritize politics or geopolitics in this case for their new Cold War more
Yes,
than
definitely.
the life or safety for their own people or the public interests in this region?
Definitely. I think that is what we are able to see from these actions of the Western powers on this matter and the allies, so-called allies of the United States, like the Philippines right now, which is very unfortunate and very going to be very disastrous for mankind, for humanity.
Well, thank you, Mr. Laura. Thank you for your time and insights. Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Bai. There has been a lot of discussion surrounding the science or the lack of it that led to the decision to discharge this nuclear contaminated water into the ocean. But from a legal perspective, how do you assess the legitimacy of this decision made by the Japanese government? The water will travel outward and affect many countries surrounding the Pacific. Will this decision be legal as it's a unilateral decision?
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking me on the show, and thank you for the question. The Japan's discharge of the nuclear contaminated water is an illegal act And we can analyze the illegality of Japan's discharge of nuclear contaminated water into the sea from the following legal perspectives, including the international treaties as well as the customary international law and general principles. Japan is a party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We usually call it the UNCLOS. The convention requires the state parties to take all necessary measures to prevent the transboundary pollution, to refrain from transferring or transforming damage or hazards from one type of pollution to another, and to minimize the discharge of toxic and hazardous substances into the marine environment to the maximum extent practicable. So Japan transfers nuclear wastewater containing radioactive substances from its domestic waters, which will move to the high seas and the judicial waters of other states. So Japan's discharge of the nuclear contaminated water into the sea is kind of violation of the UNCLOS. And also, Japan is a state party to the Convention of Nuclear Safety. The convention requires state parties with jurisdiction over a nuclear facility to assume responsibility for nuclear safety and to implement plans to decommission a nuclear facility as soon as reasonably practicable if no reasonably practicable improvements can be made to enhance the safety of the facility. So Japan has transferred the issue of nuclear safety to the world by discharging nuclear contaminated waters with radioactive substances into the sea, which is a violation of its assumption of responsibility. And also, Japan is a party to the Convention on Early Notification of the Nuclear Accident. The convention applies to transboundary international discharges, and any decision by Japan on the discharge of Fukushima nuclear contaminated water into the sea should be based on cooperation with neighboring countries. However, Japan's option of discharging into the sea is not the most practical method at the disposal of the government of Japan, and would allow nuclear contaminated water to flow with seawater to other countries, indirectly transferring the danger from Japanese territory to other countries. And also, we can consider this question from the perspective of the customary international law and the general principles of laws. The Japan's discharge of nuclear wastewater into the sea carries the risk of causing great harm to humankind as a whole, as well as to the marine environment. In this regard, Japan may incur corresponding liability, including cessation of the violation, non-repetition, and compensation. At the same time, Japan's discharge of nuclear wastewater into the sea also violates the general legal principles of international law, such as the principle of precautionary duty of care, and the responsibility not to cause environmental damage, international cooperation, floater pays, and the responsibility of state for the compensation, etc.
Well, you mentioned this existing international laws or convention of the sea or environment, because this incident is unprecedented. So it is the first time we have such a worst situation. So I wonder, is there any specific law on such practice, on such incident? Or is there a principle, people generally follow, which is agreed upon by all parties involved?
Well, when we talk about the principles accepted by all sides, actually the relevant principles I have already mentioned, which include the principle of precautionary, the duty of care, and the responsibility not to cause environmental damage. So far as the principle of precautionary is considered, which means that in order to protect the environment, states should apply precautionary measures broadly in accordance with their capabilities. And as to the duty of care, it requires a state to take the necessary measures to ensure that acts under its jurisdiction or control do not cause serious harm to the interests of other states or of the international community. And also, the responsibility not to cause environmental damage principle asks states to have the responsibility to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause harm to the environment of other states or of areas not under their jurisdiction. And also there are other principles, including the international cooperation, the polluter pays principles, and the principle of state responsibility and compensation. Although such kind of pollution damage has not happened before, but we may take some similarities for the application of the previous principles to the accidents which may caused by Japan's release of the contaminated nuclear water.
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency Director, Rafael Grossi, talked about the report prepared by the IAEA on the Fukushima nuclear, contaminated water discharge. And he said it's not an endorsement of the plan to discharge the water into the ocean. But the Japanese government have certainly seemed to regard it as such, as a clean path to discharge the water. So were the Japanese wrong to assume this? What exactly was said in the report? What is the legal base of the report, or maybe any legitimacy it provides to the Japanese side to discharge the contaminated water into the ocean?
Well, first of all, this report, its documents refer to the nature of recommendations and guidance, but are not binding in the sense of international law. And IAEA was invited by Japan to conduct the relevant assessment and review, and the scope of its mandate was limited to the assessment of the sea discharge option. And IAEA report cannot serve as a path for Japan to discharge the nuclear contaminated water into the sea. And it does not prove that ocean discharge is the safest or best way to dispose the nuclear contaminated water. And secondly, the Tokyo Shinban report pointed out that the Japanese government had in the past paid large amounts of assessed contributions and other payments to the IAEA, and that several departments of the Japanese government had dispatched the personnel to the IAEA. These factors may have an impact on IAEA in its assessment of the safety of Japan's nuclear contaminated water discharge program. So to sum up, it is not a real report that can withstand the test of science and history, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, recently the IAEA said it's the first independent sampling and analysis of the seawater near the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, since the discharging started. It confirms that the tritium levels are below Japan's operational limit. And also IAEA Director Grossi said the IAEA, as an international organization, is qualified to monitor water discharging the Fukushima plant for the international community. Then, the Chinese side had responded with different opinions. For example, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson pointed out that the IAEA Secretariat's so-called monitoring is neither mandated by the body's board of governors, nor fully discussed by member states. It's merely the Secretariat's technical consulting and support for Japan, and is neither international nor independent. So what do you make of these differences or different understanding here?
Well, Japan's discharge of the nuclear contaminated water into the ocean is an unprecedented move that bears on other countries' major interests and concerns. Actually, I definitely agree with the opinion from our Foreign Affairs Ministry that the IAEA, the report is only made by the Secretary's technical consulting and support. And also IAEA has a unique but not exclusive position in the global radioactive waste governance regime. And IAEA statute and other international law documents do not give IAEA decision-making authority over the disposal of radioactive waste. And actually, some other important organizations, such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Nuclear Energy Agency, OECD, NEA, and also the International Maritime Organization (IMO) for international shipping, or important relevant institutions. So, although IAEA has an important role to play in this field, it is doubtful whether IAEA is qualified to monitor the water discharging from Fukushima plant for international community.
Well, speak of doubts, one of, I would say the sources for people's concern comes from the poor track record of TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which is still undergoing, civil litigation over the accidents in 2011 due to violations during construction and the crisis management, as well as data fraud from years before. There have been at least 30 lawsuits against TEPCO and the Japanese government, over their failure to prepare for such a disaster, which they apparently had been warned about for years. So what more do we know about their role in the disaster? What has been the result of the civil suits against TEPCO?
Well, what Japan does contravenes its international moral responsibility and obligations under the international law. The disposal of nuclear contaminated water from TEPCO is closely related to the global marine environment and the public health. Therefore, TEPCO is not qualified to be the planner and executor of the entire nuclear contaminated water management. Due to its limited mandate, the IAEA actually failed to reveal the justification and legitimacy of Japan's ocean discharge plan and assess the long-term effectiveness of Japan's purification facility and corroborate the authenticity and accuracy of Japan's nuclear contaminated water data. Besides, state sovereignty cannot violate international norms or the common will of the international community. So there should be a consensus on Japan's nuclear contaminated water discharging arrangement reached by affected neighboring countries after sufficient consultation.
We know, according to the plan, the discharge will last as long as 30 years. So what if it is discovered at some point that, some type of irreversible damage has taken place, as a result of the nuclear water discharge? And who will be held for the responsibility, TEPCO or the Japanese government?
Well, the discharging of the nuclear contaminated water is to transfer the risk to the whole world, perpetuate the pain and the suffering to future generations of humankind, violate the right to health, the right to development, and the right to the environment of the peoples of all countries. And the discharging of the nuclear contaminated water will last 30 years if it is found, as you just mentioned, at some point in the middle, out of standard and irreversible. The Pacific Rim countries may notice that Japan should take responsibility, and the main consequences of the state's responsibility for its internationally wrongful acts are cessation of the violation, non-repetition, and compensation. And the scope of Japan's compensation should include all material or non-material loss to the injured parties by Japan's discharge of nuclear wastewater into the sea. And the potential range of the prosecutors here may include all the Pacific Rim countries I just mentioned, and also the relative rules for this responsibility is the draft articles on responsibility of states for the international wrongful acts.
With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.